Koji Suzuki's hit novel Ring's portrayal of supernatural elements as a piece of Japanese media reflects Japanese cultural beliefs regarding the supernatural and societal concerns relevant to the time of publication. Ring stands out as a figurehead in contemporary Japanese literature and a major contributor to the rise of J-horror and its globalization as a genre. The Ring franchise has a variety of mixed media and cross-cultural adaptations to show for this. Needless to say, it has proved itself a heavy-hitting contender as the most influential horror story, ever. But why? Here's what you missed on your first read of Ring by Koji Suzuki. Context, about a year ago, I took a Japanese yokai and folklore class at my university that counted towards my Japanese language and cultural degree. One of the assignments for the class required an independent study of, a piece of media or literature, didn't really matter, of our choice, to examine and make comparisons to, class materials. Very standard assignment. I had chosen Ring, the novel. One of the more mainstream options, largely because previously, for a Japanese film studies class, I had chosen Ring the film, and I have continued to fall down this endless rabbit hole just as Sadako has, obsessed with the story and the extensive academic study that the book continues to foster to this day, and all of the conversations that it inspires when you hear Ring. At the time of taking the yokai course, in an attempt to kind of understand how Western audiences and the public felt about the book and the story, I was honestly left a little disappointed by some of the book reviews I saw, because they were just not matching what I was learning in my classes, and found that many didn't immediately find the story horrific at all. So, the purpose of this video is to create a space for me to share openly about what I've learned studying Japanese media and history, take it with a grain of salt, of course, and talk about probably one of my favorite book series of all time. And I can't say that absolutely yet because I'm just started reading Loop, but fingers crossed that it ends up being a good one, because I've enjoyed it so far. But to do all of this and to circle back to my intro, one must beg the question: what makes Ring scary in the first place? Relevant to any country, the multifaceted interplay between media representations and historical and cultural contexts shapes the ideologies of greater Japanese society directly. In the context of J-horror, there's also heavy connection between its media representations and broader cultural phenomena, societal shifts, and historical events leading up to its successes and failures. We can also apply this line of thinking to Western audiences, asking what defines horror in the first place? If it is simply to frighten the viewer, how do we know that what frightens one will frighten many? As Americans, we already have the lived experience of external factors that contribute to the internal ideologies about what is innately scary, the macabre, and what makes something a dark facet of life. For example, we don't usually have to approach horror movies or books wondering if they will be scary. They are, by design, pulled from an established regime of values associated with the cultural context of the target audience. Not to mention the amount of editing and reviewing these works receive before getting published or released. When Hollywood eventually runs out of ideas, it does what America is best at and looks for inspiration from the outside. After all, The Ring 2002 is an adaptation of a film, which is an adaptation of a book. Can we really say that the Western remake matches the same moral questioning the novel inspires? How much of an homage is it to the source material if it has been completely adapted to suit Western taste? Is it meant to be an homage at all? But to put some distance between the films and the book, we have to ask the question: what made Ring scary in the context of 1991 Japan? Let's examine the social and political world of Japan at the time. The early 1990s really highlight the sharp transitive events that would separate the tumultuous Showa era to the newly instated Heisei era, or era of peace. The economic miracle of significant industrial growth and output that allowed the nation to recover post-World War II was brought to an abrupt end in the 1980s with the infamous bubble burst. The wealth disparity between social classes widened. The effects of rapid industrialization in city landscapes started to take their toll on the environment and public health. The lost decade had just begun, seeing an increase in unemployment and company downsizing. The few people that did have jobs were being overworked and underpaid. Everyone was in debt. It was a pretty tough time to have a life in Japan at this point. But one could argue it's out of these times of hardship we almost always see the most influential art crafted and the best stories told. It's almost like when this happens, we hit this weird point of limbo where we're just kind of stuck in between what was and what will come. It's almost like a liminal space. Just waiting in need to pass the time. A tunnel loomed in front of him, its entrance outlined in brilliant orange light. On the other side, just after he entered the Atami Kannami Highway, he should start to see signs for South Hokane Pacific Land. The long tunnel would take him through the Tanna Bridge. As he entered it, the sound of the wind changed. At the same time, his flesh, the passenger seat, and everything else in the car was bathed in orange light. He could feel his calm slipping away. He could feel his hackles rise. There were no cars coming from the opposite direction. The wipers squeaked as they rubbed against the now dry windshield. He turned them off. He should reach his destination by 8. He didn't quite feel like flooring it, although the road was empty. Unconsciously, Asakawa was dreading the place he was heading to. The practicality and pure existence of folklore and yokai, or Japanese ghosts and monsters, derive from their innate ability to resonate with social anxieties and fears from a given period in historical context. This single factor has remained vital in understanding the emergence of new yokai figures throughout history, just as applicable to local legends, fairy tales, media figures, and more. This is well known and documented. However, the main characteristics of these supernatural stories and icons depend on their position in liminal spaces, a concept stemming from Zen, Buddhist, and Shinto beliefs, respectively. Yokai's inherent liminality in their position, nature, and emergence translates directly to modern horror and Japanese fiction today. Used as a mode of commentary on social issues and concerns, yokai's inherent liminality in their position, nature, and emergence translates directly to modern horror and Japanese fiction today, used as a mode of commentary on social issues and concerns most of the time. Concerning Ring, the thematic commentary of contemporary dependence on technology, its ubiquity, influence, and advances, and its destructive, alienating nature often surfaces as the primary social anxiety reflected in the book and the film adaptation. This makes sense, especially considering the age of industrialization Japan has been reaping the benefits of for 30 years has just come to an abrupt halt, altering the state of the entire nation. Another social commentary the book provides is about attitudes around queer identities and emerging conversations around transgender, intersex, and homosexual individuals and women's rights in the early 1990s. In combination with the gay boom in media, recognition of social stratification for queer individuals and gender roles, and the foreboding of the consequences of the economic bubble burst in Japan, the inclusion of an intersex character proves to be not only stylistically relevant in recognition of Japanese supernatural understanding, but also in realizing direct connections between social anxieties and horror as a whole. This doesn't mean that Japan thinks intersex people are monsters, though there is something to be said there about why you have to ask that question, but rather in having Sadako be intersex, this adds to her complexity as a character and adds cultural context and dimension to her story as being the bad one. She embodies the essence of in-betweenness, otherness, and the nature of the outside. On top of all this, she was murdered. Rightfully so, she's vengeful and acts on it through the birth of this supernatural virus, something only a person like her would be able to create given her position as a supernatural force, a woman who faced so much trouble in life, but only finds power after death. But is she really the villain? Or just another victim to modernity, industry, the stresses of capitalism, or perhaps patriarchy and never-ending gaze of men and the public eye? Sadako herself perfectly encapsulates the onryo, or vengeful yurei spirit, taking heavy derivation from figures such as okiku and oiwa. Criteria for this identification usually requires some form of betrayal or experience of a traumatic event to then seek revenge on the wrongdoers. As examined in folklore academia, it's recognized that stories and figures reappear, disappear, and evolve throughout history. And so, through this lens, we can see that Sadako is a character of modern folklore in Japan. But what made the story of Sadako stand out? The history of folkloric stories and yokai is long and extensive, but to summarize, they played a big role in defining horror and were generally considered scary. Their popularity peaked during the Tokugawa period, otherwise known as the Edo period, and the genre would finally become displaced during the Meiji period. Japan would be heavily influenced by the West, replacing kimonos with suits, standardizing written and spoken Japanese, inviting foreigners to study in Japan, and abolishing the samurai class. It was this nationwide movement to advance and improve that inspired men like Inoue Enro to encourage Japan's development through the elimination of anything associated with traditional Japan, particularly yokai. It would be the astounding power and influence of figures like Inoue, obsessed with Western reasoning, that the horror and fear of yokai would begin to fade and taper, due mostly to his work in founding yokaiology and publishing books such as 100 Yokai Stories. His life's work was dedicated to scientific reasoning and disproving the existence of yokai, wanting to wake up the public to their outlived, overdone, silly, superstitious attitudes. Electricity made sense of strange events, and Western medicine replaced the work of shaman practice. For example, his scientific sentiments and trust in Western medicine would largely contribute to the end of yokai's association with the horror genre. After yokai's reputation as terrifying monsters came to an end with the development of technology and modernization, people took liberties in using these monsters in other genres and commentaries outside of horror. One example is how yokai became the tools of artists and the government to spread political messages and propaganda to the masses in the wake of ultranationalism. It wouldn't be until a couple decades later, after the war, when yokai would begin being used to promote peace after the atrocities seen by the war, especially with the new fears of Western technology after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Films such as the Yokai Monsters trilogy, for example, would become popular, all during an age in film where nostalgia and longing for the past is ever present. Godzilla even serves as an example in this case too, because for the first time, yokai are depicted as keepers of the peace and the guardians of Japan. After these films, yokai would boom in popularity, but again, outside of the horror genre, as attitudes within the genre itself were beginning to shift. Pokemon are probably the most simple example of this shift from horrific folktale mysteries to cute cartoon figures in pop culture. And so, with the rise of modern technology and changes within the horror genre in the context of Japanese historical events, yokai are no longer scary in modern-day Japan. Following this history of yokai and their fall away from horror, it's noted that the increase in influence from the West and use of technology would evolve the fears of Japanese people away from conventionally scary monsters and ghouls. Ghouls? I don't know. In 1970, around the end of the peak of yokai use in horror films, Masahiro Mori would publish an original essay, The Uncanny Valley. In this essay, the term Uncanny Valley would be coined, referring to the eeriness of technology and the rapidly attracted interest in robotics. The term is unanimous with the horror genre today, but at the time implied that there may have been some form of questioning in the relationship the human race will one day have with technology. What makes something human, and why human likeness is so terrifying? The main plot point of our story rests upon the mysterious nature of a videotape that kills the viewer 7 days after watching. So, knowing all of this cultural context, That's not overwhelming at all. What is the main point of Ring? I mean, viruses, vengeful spirits, videotapes. What's the significance of all these things together? Ryuji's arms had been folded behind his head. Now he stretched them wide. His eyes glittered. Don't you find it fascinating, Asakawa? The idea that genes could escape from our cells and become another life form? Maybe all opposites were originally identical, even light and darkness. Before the Big Bang, they were living together in peace with no contradiction. God and the devil, too. All the devil is a god who fell from grace. They're the same thing originally. Male and female? It used to be that all living things were hermaphroditic, like worms or slugs, with both female and male sex organs. Don't you think that's the ultimate symbol of power and beauty? Ryuji laughed as he said this. Be true to what you're feeling this instant. All we have in front of us is an uncertain future. The future will take care of itself. When humanity gets around to applying its ingenuity, who knows if it won't find a solution? It's just another trial for the human species. In every age, the devil reappears in a different guise. You can stamp it out, and he'll keep coming back, over and over. There are many elements in Ring that play with this notion of opposites. Light and dark, future and past, good and evil, factual and imaginary, reality and the abstract, the city and the countryside, what's innate and not, life and death, science and supernatural. Asakawa and Ryuji face each one, while Sadako fixes herself between these dualities. There are no morals in this story, only the illusion of choice in the never-ending game that is life. And Ryuji's character being the perfect example of this notion. See Spiral. Ring revived the horror genre simply by bringing into question the validity and seriousness of something we all fear equally: human existence. And so, I ask again, is Sadako really the villain? Or is it the Watcher who judges her? All of these things contribute to Ring being scary, the country of Japan understanding why it's scary and that being reciprocated, and it doing well. And the version we get of it, I just don't know if that really comes across in the Western adaptation. But if you made it this far, I hope this sparked some internal dialogue, and hopefully it inspires you to dig a little bit deeper in the reading that you do for fun.